interesting and highly researched report. I just want, since this is promoted by balance and accuracy in journalism, I just want to comment that I think the New York Times, in just reporting the 3 wars that they foresee in Syria, or that actually someone foresees in Syria, is just objective reporting, and we should not ask for editorial outrage or condemnation in reporting. And I think that's a mistake that some people in their passion make.
You raise an excellent point, but actually it was an op-ed piece specifically that discussed that spokesperson. So it was a space within the New York Times for editorializing, and the journalist actually did editorialize because he was, I mean, when the journalist said that he's surprised at their disarming candor and did not in any way critique the statement, I am sure that had an Arab leader of a government that is not an ally to the Obama administration, had the Syrian government themselves went on record as saying this, had Bashar al-Assad said, after we win this war with the rebels, we're then going to go kill all the Christians here, I doubt that the journalist would have said that he was impressed with the disarming candor of Bashar al-Assad rather than he would have been outraged. So I agree with you, had that been a piece in the news section of the New York Times, but it was actually a piece in an op-ed page.
Great presentation, thank you so much. I've definitely learned a lot about the rebels and the difficulties that are, why we should not be arming the rebels. But I'm wondering, what would we recommend if, let's say, as people of peace, people who care about human rights and bringing an end to suffering, try to envision a better world? Let's imagine that we had a government that cared and put priority upon human rights, and that was, maybe imagine we're Ecuadorian citizens, I don't know. But what would we ask that government to do, assuming that it had a certain amount of sufficient power in a situation like Syria?
You raise a very difficult question. And as somebody who believes that we need to choose the path that itself employs the principles that we believe in, I can tell you what I don't want done, which means that the government should not be supporting sanctions, because we've seen what the sanctions have done in Iraq. 13 years worth of economic sanctions on Iraq led to the complete destruction of the country and devastation of more than hundreds of thousands of lives. So we know that economic sanctions would hurt the wrong people. Okay, so that becomes a problem. And that was one of the things that was touted. We know that a no-fly zone cannot be imposed unless it's supported militarily. So a no-fly zone becomes basically a declaration of war. So that becomes rejected. We already reject armament. So then the question becomes, what kinds of pressures could be put on all the players in the battlefield to get them to the negotiation table? And how can we get them to sit down and talk? And what are the pressures that could be placed that would not harm innocent civilians in the process? And that honestly is a very difficult question. And that is a question that a lot of us who have been agonizing over the bloodshed in Syria for years have been discussing amongst ourselves and reached different conclusions. My perspective is that I would simply put pressure on the Syrian government for negotiations. And I would imagine that right now, given that the Syrian government is supported by Russia and China, okay, if there is also pressure being given on the Syrian rebels, getting the Syrian rebels to negotiate, given that they are under zero pressure to negotiate, absolutely no pressure, okay, then what would happen if the Qataris and the Saudis and the United States and France and Turkey and Israel, all who have claimed to be supporters of these rebels, actually demand of the rebels to negotiate? And let's say that happens, and then the rebels say, we do want to negotiate, and then the Syrian government goes, oh, you believe me? I don't want to negotiate. Okay, well then that would say something. But until we're at that stage where the Syrian rebels themselves are saying we want to negotiate, all we have right now is the statement from the Syrian government going, I want to negotiate, and they don't want to negotiate with me. The Syrian government has said time and time again, yes, it wants to negotiate only with Syrians. So it refuses to sit down and negotiate with an armed brigade that is non-Syrian, and its demand is put down your weapons and then we negotiate. Okay? So we have a saying in Arabic, you know, let's take the liar as far as the liar can go. So if we are skeptical of this position of the Syrian government, well, let's push them. Let's call their bluff, if it is a bluff. But as of yet, when you have one side that's saying, you know, I'm calling for negotiations, but they don't want to negotiate, so they're forcing me to just commit violence, which is the narrative of the Syrian government, okay? And then you have the Syrian rebels that are saying, you know, all we want is more weapons because this can only be fought on the battlefield, and consequently just give us more weapons and let's fight it that way. What would happen if they get deprived of their weapons by their allies who demand that they negotiate? What would happen then? Okay. What would happen to these 6,000 foreign fighters who want to go to experience the romanticization of jihad as they see it in their warped minds? They would have no reason to go. You know, I mean, I think it's a struggle that it's worth fighting to see how far that would go. And ultimately, I very much believe that this is a Syrian conflict that needs to be dealt with by Syrians themselves. So as much as we can de-internationalize the conflict, the better it would become. And the only action that we can ask of international players is the action to push all the other players toward nonviolence negotiation.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Specifically, though, if we wanted to, would it be possible to provide sufficient humanitarian aid support to countries like Jordan and Turkey or whoever's on the border that are receiving refugees? Would it be possible to provide to enforce a humanitarian corridor of some sort to get people out? That, I mean, the suffering of the innocent civilians is what I'm.
Yes.
And I know, I understand what you're saying. Negotiations are very complicated, and there's lots of politics about it, and it has to happen for the war to ultimately end. But at the humanitarian level, is there something that
You raise an excellent point, and you're using particular language that I'm glad that you're using, because it's very powerful language, which is this term of a humanitarian corridor.
Yeah, I don't know.
And the Turkish government has been calling for a humanitarian corridor. And the aspect of a humanitarian corridor means to create a corridor means you need to provide military support to make it safe, which means we're militarizing the humanitarian corridor. And how do you decide what part of Syria or Lebanon will become that humanitarian corridor, and which military will serve to ensure that it remains a corridor? And by then we've actually gone into the so-called humanitarian military war. It becomes a fine line. I hear you most definitely, and the refugees, particularly in Jordan and in Lebanon, are suffering a great deal. I mean, the numbers in Lebanon, the Lebanese government claims that there's more than 1 million Syrians in Lebanon. And to give that meaning, the Lebanese population is approximately 5 million. So now there's 1 million Syrians in a very problematic country to begin with, okay, to say it calmly. But the Syrians themselves, more than they want support as refugees, they want to be able to return to their homes. So support the refugees would be a good short-term solution, but it would not be a long-term solution. That's one issue. The other issue that I wanted to bring up that you raised that I just slipped my mind, I'm so sorry.
Well, I was saying provide funds to those countries that are in the position of receiving refugees.
Right, which would be, you know, primarily Jordan, which has been asking for that support, Lebanon, which has been asking for that support. Turkey, incidentally, actually set up the refugee camps in Turkey before there were any refugees, which that alone causes one to go, what is the position of the Turkish government in Syria then? Because I hadn't heard of any other government in the world that actually sets up refugee camps before there are refugees. We typically have the other problem. But that they actually had set up refugee camps before there were any refugees in Turkey.
Why did they do that?
Excellent question. Unless they were expecting refugees. And why would they expect refugees? You know, questions that I think we need to ask. But what we know the facts on the ground is that they had set that up before there were refugees. So then where does that take us? So there definitely is that issue. There also is the issue, there was recent evidence released in Al-Akhbar newspaper, a Lebanese newspaper that you can also get in English because it's available in English, that said that the Qatari Red Crescent, which is, you know, equivalent to the Red Cross, has been using their money to actually provide weapons to the rebels. And they're on the record as having that. So again, it raises these as questions. Yeah. But the fundamental issue is, how do we make Syria itself less violent and safer? And we need to recognize that yes, we do have a problematic regime, and we do have an armed, loose opposition. But we also have two other factors in Syria. We have a small, non-violent internal opposition in Syria. Strong, I mean strong but small. Strong in the sense they're steadfast but small. Non-violent internal opposition. How do we strengthen their voice? How do we make them stronger? And how do we get to them, okay? And what they want and what they're demanding is end the arms. Their voice becomes completely either ignored or misappropriated by the rebels themselves. So we've got that aspect. We have certain members of the internal opposition that are actually within the Syrian government, such as the Minister of National Reconciliation, Ali Haidar, who before he became Minister of National Reconciliation within the Syrian government was and remains a member of the internal opposition to the Syrian government. He's on the record and continues to say, I am a member of the internal opposition and I call for everybody to sit down and talk. And before, when I used to hear him, I said it would be so easy to call for political negotiations if you didn't have any blood on your hands. But Ali Haidar himself lost his son. His son, who was a medical student in Damascus, was killed by one of the rebels. And Ali Haidar still goes on record and says, yes, my son is a martyr, and I repeat what I said. The problem is political. It needs to be dealt with politically, which means we need to deal with it through negotiation. So there definitely is that element. And there's a third element within Syria that we can't ignore, which is that two reasons. Given the complexity of the Syrian society and given the actions of the Syrian rebels, the Syrian government itself has a sizable support within Syria. This is not a government akin to Hosni Mubarak in Egypt before his downfall, where the majority of Egyptians hated him and the ones that support him were economically benefiting from him. You do have a sizable portion of the Syrian population, particularly the religious minorities, who are in support of this leader. So then where do we go? You know, where do we go given the complexity of the internal dynamics? And again, in my opinion, the only way to go is to push for political negotiations. And the only way to strengthen political negotiations is to stop arming the battlefields.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I just want to follow up with that with a quick comment, which I think that we often make a mistake here in the West, that we view conflicts overseas with a sense of Orientalism. What I mean by that is this conflict was taking place, say, in Northern Ireland, where there was a conflict, where that was dealt with by the English government demanding on the IRA to put down your arms and we will find a political answer. And the world embraced that and that worked. When the Syrian government, of course, is saying the same thing, it's mocked at. And it's mocked at not just because they're on the other side, but because there's a sense, I believe, of Orientalism, that those are people of the East. The rules of the West do not apply on the East, and it's not good enough to apply our rules on them. Could you comment on that as well?
Unfortunately, I think there's remnants of Orientalism even within the Orient itself, you know, that we have accepted internal racism. Yes, there is definitely that element. But I'm much more cynical about governments, and I think that when a government chooses not to believe another government, it's because they have an ulterior reason not to believe it. And I believe very much that the position of the French and the Turkish and the Israeli government, as well as the United States government and the British government, Tony Blair is on record as very much supporting a no-fly zone and arming the rebels, that given their historic record, these are not administrations that believe in democracy. I mean, no one with a straight face can say that the US administration truly, in the depths of its hearts, wants to see a democratic regime in Syria. I mean, why would they want to see a democratic regime in Syria? You come up with a democratic regime in Syria, you will, I guarantee it, get a government that will be vehemently anti-Israel, that will demand that the Golan Heights be liberated, a Golan Heights that has been occupied since '67. I guarantee it. If we were to get a fully democratic president in Syria, that would be one of the demands. So why would the US government want a democratic representation in Syria? I mean, why would they? Actually, I would argue the US government doesn't want democratic representation in the United States, which is why we have gerrymandering here. So if we have gerrymandering here in the United States, how can we believe that we have a government that suddenly really wants to push for democracy overseas, and it's because of their push for democracy that they feel unable to believe Bashar al-Assad when he calls for negotiations? No, I don't think so. I think every single government that's playing here, including the Russians and Chinese, have their own objectives. And they're going with these own objectives, and then they employ a narrative that would be comfortable for their own populace. So the Obama administration employs a narrative of wanting to minimize casualties and wanting to be the peacemaker and wanting to support the people and protect them from the use of chemical weapons, okay, which has become this horror statement of chemical weapons, just like WMDs, the term weapons of mass destruction was created against Iraq. And what is that term, weapons of mass destruction? I'm arguing that Congress is more sensitive to the populace's demands and that the populace has become more skeptical of the administrations in general, because there's a limit to how many times we can hear lie upon lie upon lie upon lie upon lie and still somehow believe it. I don't believe we're as skeptical as a populace as we need to be. There's still too many of us that think that the NSA surveillance is acceptable, which I still can't grasp around that. Okay, but I'm arguing for that. So Orientalism is used as a narrative by these governments to push particular actions, but whether we as a populace then choose to accept it becomes what we can act upon here. And if we call for negotiations in Ireland, we need to call for negotiations in Syria. If the Obama administration is calling for negotiations in Egypt, we need to call for negotiations everywhere. You know, we believe the Obama administration is on the record as believing in a roadmap for peace in Israel, and yet they're against a alleged roadmap for peace in Syria. I mean, we can go on and on and on and poke holes, and there's so many different contradictions that the administration shows, and that empowers us in the way that we can then speak to different communities to get this issue across the board.
This has been so informative, I don't want to stop you, but you have gotten to Israel-Palestine in the last few minutes. And I wondered if you could comment on what you think Kerry wants. I mean, he's distracted at the moment, but Jonathan Cook says the United States wants to impose a settlement on the Palestinians that is really unsatisfactory. He wants them to be giving up lots of rights and territory. And I wonder what you're seeing in that dynamic. You know, what do you see the U.S. government trying to do there now?
I see that the U.S. government has been quite consistent, administration after administration, with the only inconsistency coming from George Bush Sr. And since George Bush Sr., there has been a strong consistency in the U.S. administration's perspectives, which is Israel can do no wrong and the Palestinians need to give up more, and we're going to call it a roadmap for peace. And we're going to declare that there'll be a Palestinian state in 2 years, and then 2 years later we're going to declare it will happen in 2 years, and it will go on and on and on. And that has been the position from George Bush Jr. onwards. And the only caveat I'm giving to George Bush Sr. is at one time he actually wanted to give conditional military aid to Israel. But since then, until now, there's been a rush by presidents to try to be more acquiescent to the Israeli government, rather than to try to actually be demanding and try to legislate US law. So I don't see it as being, I don't see any different, I just see an acceleration in the previous policies that the Obama administration has been doing here. And when we look at Israel-Palestine, the situation is quite horrific internally. It's horrific for the Palestinians who are facing increased home demolitions, who are facing increased illegal settlement expansions, who are facing increased racism even within Israel. And I would also argue that the Israeli state is becoming, I mean, they're taking racism to a whole new level. And we've been hearing these past few years, I hope we've all been hearing these past few years, of the actions of the Israeli government against Africans. in their forced sterilization of African women. And right now the Israeli government is on the record as telling African nations, and I'm not making this up, it would be too horrific for me to make this up. The Israeli government is on the record as telling African nations, you take our Africans from Israel and we will give you weapons. So it's a different kind of trafficking now and of humans, okay? So we have an extraordinarily racist state that has gone on the record as being racist against other Jews, because these are African Jews, by the way, okay? As well as other Africans themselves who are not Jews, who are going there as refugees, okay? They're on the record as being racist towards them. How could we expect them to not be racist against the very people whose land they have stolen in 1947, 1948, 1949, and who they're on the record as calling for their continuous expulsion and disposition, which is the Palestinians who have been able to secure Israeli citizenships within Israel proper. So it is quite horrific. The only bit of good news is what the international boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement have been able to secure in victories. And the level of victories of the small, grassroots, and I say small because they're college-led, they're youth-led, they're not very rich, they're not being organized by any centralized corporate structure. They're beautiful, they're impassioned youth, and the amount of victories that they have achieved internationally have been quite significant. And you all can go to electronicintifada.org and see the beautiful timeline that the BDS movement has done, an interactive timeline over their successes just over the past 8 years. Really beautiful successes. And here is where I think that we can actually pull the struggle forward. If we can be calling for an end to discrimination. I mean, there can't be a two-state solution right now. It's geographically impossible. It's just, there is no Palestinian land that can be contiguously met right now, given the status of the apartheid wall and given the status of the settlements. It's simply geographically impossible. Yes, and the wall that can go up can come down, okay? But personally, I don't like this narrative that has been propelled by Western Europe and the United States just over the past 50, 60 years, which is that people of different religions cannot live together. And that was one of the narratives that they used to break up the former Yugoslavia. And we still hear this narrative in the way that we talk about each other. There's still this tendency to segregate. And so ultimately, the peaceful solution that I envision and that numerous other people envision, and there's been a growing movement both within Israel and within the occupied territories for this movement, is a one-state secular binational solution, where you have Israelis and Palestinians of different religions living side by side, just like we've been for centuries, and no problem, and let's just live together and be together.
A lot of Palestinians don't want that.
There's a growing movement now being resurfaced, and if we go back through Palestinian history, we see that Yasser Arafat actually brought up this one-state solution back in the early 70s, and it was completely dismissed by the Israeli government. So there is a history towards that can be resurfaced. And I believe that one of the reasons that Palestinians may want a two-state solution is they believe that a one-state secular solution is impossible, which is how I believe that the Israeli government has been shooting itself in the foot. Because by making a two-state solution impossible, they're making a one-state secular solution the only possible. And that is where I believe we will ultimately go, if climate change will allow us to live the next 100 years.
We don't have actions planned that we could have announced in the announcement section. But there will be some opportunities for BDS actions in the season, starting in the fall. And if Badge would like to help us organize for that, we'll send you information and use your list to tell your audience about what's going on.
Dave Lippman has announced that he's doing a tour this part of the country in the fall. So he's done significant work with BDS and just other ethical projects. So
we should keep in touch about it.
Oh yeah, we do. We can, yeah.
Yes.
Going back 2 years to the beginning of the war in Syria, could you please provide some analysis from that standpoint of what would have been proper behavior for U.S., other concerned Western powers, what we may have the general population may have missed through the press of just to have a little bit more understanding from that period of that conflict that could provide more understanding of how things have so horribly spun out of control.
I'm not sure, I can't really answer what you may have missed in the US press 2 years ago, for a very simple reason that 2 years ago I was really obsessed with the Arab press and what, having been in Lebanon 2 years ago, that's where my focus was. So I feel ill-equipped to talk about the US press 2 years ago. But as for the situation in Syria 2 years ago, when the conflict broke out in March 2011, there are various different scenarios, and I'm going to present the most conservative scenario, the most accepted scenario, which may not necessarily be the most valid scenario. But I just want to present what is generally accepted. And what is generally accepted is that we had the start of nonviolent demonstrations in different parts of Syria, and to which the Syrian government, there's no other word that I could use, quite stupidly, I believe, not just criminally, but quite stupidly, responded with aggression and with detention. So we had, in response to certain nonviolent protests in Syria, the Syrian government responded by detaining and arresting and torturing individuals. Now from there, we then get two stories. One story is that there were foreign elements that were involved in actually killing civilians as a false flag to raise the ire against the Syrian government. And then there's the other story, which is that the Syrian government itself went ahead and shot at civilian protesters and caused the first massive moral outrage in Syria. Regardless which story we accept, we know that what happened after that, a few months into the conflict, is that there began a much stronger armed element in Syria than there had been previously. We know that in April of 2011, there was the first attack against the Syrian army, in which it was a surprise attack against the Syrian army. And we know that 1 month after that is when we had the burial alive of Syrian soldiers. And this was an act that the Free Syrian Army at that time, which it was still more coherent as a Free Syrian Army, went on record as supporting. So possibly not so much, possibly in March when the conflict broke out, allies of the Syrian government and opponents of the Syrian government could have raised the flag right there to say, no, this is not the way you deal with protesters. And then coming in April and May of 2011, the element could have been, wait a second, now we've got armed elements here. Now we really need to do all that we can to stop the violence to get people to talk. Okay? Stop the violence to get people to talk, which ironically is what the Obama administration is asking for in Egypt. Let's calm the tension between the Muslim Brotherhood and between the military. Let's calm it and wait for a civilian transition. Okay? But that wasn't what happened in Syria. Because what happened in Syria just a few months into the conflict, officially, not conspiratorially, is there became massive international intervention. Massive international intervention. So on one hand, yes, the Syrian government has been and remains to be guilty of human rights violations, no question, previous to 2011 and since. On the other hand, we have the beginning of a nonviolent internal opposition that just a few months later was squashed through very well-equipped, well-financed counter-revolutionaries who transformed it into an armed proxy war. And then we've had it over 2 years escalate dramatically into the situation we see now, where it has only been escalating and escalating almost exponentially. And so the longer and longer we delay, the longer and longer international players delay in pushing for negotiations and continue to arm the rebels, the greater and greater and greater crimes will be committed. Now one could say, why am I only talking about arming the rebels and I haven't said one thing about not arming the Syrian army? Well, because I think it's a moot point. If we're going to be demanding from the Russians not to arm the Syrian army, I think that's a moot point. The Syrian army has enough arms. Okay, it's an army. Okay, and if we take away from it its official reason for the violence, then we can empower the negotiations further. And the official reason that the Syrian government gives for its violence is it is in response to the Syrian rebels, or the rebels in Syria more accurately. Now that is the same excuse the rebels give. Okay? But the US and France and Turkey and Qatar and Saudi Arabia and England and Israel are supporting the rebels, which we need to stop and go, those are strange bedfellows. Really, really strange bedfellows. For the Secretary of State John Kerry to be meeting in so-called Friends of Syria conference with monarchies, calling for democracy, it's just more irony than I think we should accept. But that's a long-winded answer to your question.
Boston Globe a while back had an article about that time.
The Boston Globe a while back ran an article in which it reported that Walid Jumla, I don't know who that is, the Lebanese warden lord, spent much of the last 2 years trying fruitlessly to persuade Washington and Moscow to midwife a political solution. Now he's given up. Atop the pile of books on his coffee table sits The Great Game, a tale of how superpowers coldly schemed for centuries over Central Asia, heedless of consequences for the region. Don't use mine. All right. Anyway, I'm saying that this is harking back to the past, that he sees now in Syria a new incarnation of the old conflict where superpowers were scheming over the Central Asia, you know, and just really don't care about what happens in that area as long as it suits their interests. And he says that they don't care about the cost to the Syrians, actually, on either side. What do you think about that? And so what are the political interests that the United States stands to?
Well, I mean, again, the U.S. administration is on the record as not calling for a victory, but calling for a balance on the ground. Yes. And calling for a balance on the ground is the kind way of saying, kill each other. And Henry Kissinger has repeated that claim, and there is another journalist, a journalist in one of the op-ed pieces, I believe in the New York Times, and I can get you that op-ed, that specifically said, we need to step aside and just let them kill each other, okay? So one could argue that one of the objectives might be the destruction of the Syrian infrastructure itself, the dismantling of the Syrian army itself, given that when we look at the region, okay, and we say, okay, what has happened to the region in the past 10, 15 years? Okay, and who have been strong elements in the region over the past 10, 15 years? If we go back to the 1980s, we have a region that had a very strong Iraq with a powerful Iraqi army, and then a Syria and an Egypt. Okay, those are the three main Arab armies in the region. Okay, now the Egyptian army through Camp David has been set aside, and there's not much worry over the Egyptian army acting independently. Okay, but then we've had Iraq completely destroyed through the Iraq-Iran war, where the United States supported both sides, and then truly completely destroyed during the Gulf War and the sanctions, and since 2003 destroyed even further, where we have on the record that the massive massacres that occurred in Iraq post-2003 between the Sunnis and the Shias in Iraq did not occur in spite of the US Army presence. They occurred because of the US Army presence. So we know for a fact that the United States Army in Iraq actually propagated Sunni Shia violence in Iraq, which was a violence that was ahistoric and not intrinsic to Iraq, where you have significant intermarriages. Okay? So we've had an exponential increase of destruction of Iraq since 1990 until now, arguably since the 1980s with the war in Iran, since now. So we can put Iraq aside, and then we put our attention to Syria. And what is the problem with Syria? Okay? Syria is not a Venezuela in any way, shape, or form. I'm not going to compare Bashar al-Assad to, I still miss him, to Hugo Chavez. Okay? I'm not going to compare him. However, one thing that the Syrian government does that the US administrations do not like is the Syrian government is on the record as being steadfast in their support of Hezbollah. Steadfast in their support of Hezbollah. And Hezbollah has been on the record as being steadfast in wanting to maintain its own armament to use particularly to defend Lebanon from continuous and possible further Israeli incursions and invasions. Okay? So we have here the only organization in the region that has managed to liberate Arab lands without a peace treaty, without a surrender. The only organization that has managed to defeat the military objectives of the Israeli army is not an army, but is Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is on the record as being supported financially and militarily by the Syrian government. And the Syrian government is very steadfast in wanting that support. So, let's change that government. You know, and it helps that the Syrian government also commits human rights violations, but the US administration really doesn't care about human rights violations, given that it's in bed with Saudi Arabia and Qatar that commit human rights violations. I mean, you know, so there's that element. So of course we can get that government changed into a more subservient government, kind of like the Jordanian government. And if we can get a Jordanian government to take over, akin to the Jordanian government in Syria, then we have complete surrender, a complete dismissal of Arab resistance movements to Israel, and another agency for US battlefields to operate, as the US operates quite freely within Jordan. We can get that there. So get the Syrian government to be even more subservient. And one way to do that is by destroying the Syrian army. And it really speaks volumes that half of the fatalities counted thus far, almost half of the fatalities counted thus far, have been members of the Syrian army. I mean, that speaks volumes right there, okay? So when we look at that, it could be then that one objective is the continual destruction of Syria, because you know what happens after the US destroys a country? They then get to, quote, rebuild it, using that country's resources, and the country never gets rebuilt, but then using that country's resources to fund US corporations, and Iraq has not been rebuilt, but it gets more money siphoned, and we do have a $1 trillion monster that we need to feed. So that could be the objective. The other objective could be to dismiss and dismantle resistance movement and to create more acquiescent, subservient governments in the region. And of course, there could be a third objective, which is, what better nail to create than Islamist regimes? And if we do want to create a nail, there is no better nail than an Islamist regime. You know, an Islamist regime that is not based on moderate Islam, that's based on a very skewed, ahistoric reading of Islam that is not even intrinsic to the region. I mean, the kind of Sharia that these rebels want to impose on Syria is not intrinsic to Syria. It comes from Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's completely foreign to the region. And if we have more pockets of Muslim brotherhoods, which is particularly the objective of the Turkish government right now, which is led by the Muslim Brotherhood, which is particularly the objective of the Qatari government, which is very pro-Muslim Brotherhood, okay, then we create a region that fulfills the narrative of being homogeneous by religion, and we fulfill the narrative that Muslims and Christians and Jews just cannot live together because, I mean, Sunnis and Shias can't live together. And if Sunnis and Shias can't live together, then of course a Muslim and a Jew can't live together. And during all this process, in Syria and in Iraq and in Egypt, the #1 refugee community has been the Christian community of that area. They've been the #1 refugees. The first to be displaced have been the Christian community of that area. And these are the oldest Christians in the world. And they've been displaced. And again, it fulfills a particular narrative. And fulfilling that narrative goes back to fulfilling that $1 trillion monster. And it really, again, speaks, if we are creating such a military machinery, that military machinery itself has to create enemies because it needs a reason to exist, and it will create them either through think tanks or through military warfare or through warped, neoliberal thinking. One way or another, they will be created. Okay, I'm not arguing that they are creating them deliberately to have an enemy, but once we are in a war thinking mode, and if all you give me is a hammer, all I see is a nail. And we have an administration, both Democrat and Republican, that has only seen hammers. So consequently, the world then becomes a battlefield of nails, rather than arguing for heterogeneous lifestyles of people living together, of different ethnicities and different religions living side by side, and that is the historical narrative. That is the true historical reading, particularly of the Middle East, of different ethnicities and different religions living together, not broken up into nation states that would be easier to control and easier to perish. So again, sorry for these long answers to your very particular question.
I'm glad that you brought up Hezbollah because they've been one of the recent players that have been involved, and you also brought up the problem of the presence of foreign militias fighting on behalf of the Free Syrian Army.
Yes.
And I think that Hezbollah's presence is a testament to the other side, the Assad regimes being guilty of the same thing. And bringing up Hezbollah by proxy involves Iran. And so my question was, we know that historically Iran, Ahmadinejad, and the religious leaders have provided support to Assad, both Hafez al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad. So given the recent elections, do you think Rouhani, who's been called a moderate, do you think that his election will affect the support that Iran will provide to the current regime?
I really don't know enough about the current Iranian leader to be able to answer confidently, but just based on the information that I know about Iran, I would guesstimate no. That I do not envision that the Iranian government would set aside its support for Syria. if I were to think like an Iranian, and here I am representing the main Shia government in the region, okay, and I am being surrounded by, whether it's in Egypt where there was a recent killing of 4 Shia because they were Shia for no other reason, okay, whether it's in Syria where we have rebel militants that are on the record as calling for the killing of Shia, whether it is to the south in Bahrain and in the Emirates where they are on the record as being discriminatory against Shia. And if I'm going to look and I'm going to say, okay, and who's my other ally here? It's the Syrian government. And if I do not support the Syrian government in this fight, then guess what? I'm going to be surrounded by stronger Sunni forces that regard Shias as their enemy. That does not seem to be logical for the Iranian government to do, regardless of the particular leader, unless they have a really, really big reason to do it. And I don't envision them having a really, really big reason to do it. I mean, so for example, if the US administration were to go to the Iranian administration to go, you know what, we're going to lift sanctions. We're going to support you in your nuclear energy struggle. We are going to support you economically. We are going to befriend you just like we befriend other allies. And you know, and we might not even spy on you like we spy on our allies, okay? We're going to go that far. If they're going to be that transformative, yeah, then possibly. But the likelihood of that happening is quite nil, So it doesn't seem rational for me that an Iranian government would leave its main ally in the region, just like it does not seem rational for me that the Russian government would leave its main ally in the region. So I believe that Russia and Iran are both behaving rationally according to their own particular national interests, just as Hezbollah is behaving rationally according to its own interest. Because if Hezbollah were to lose the Syrian regime, okay, then it would lose one of its prime benefactors. And we have to recognize that Hezbollah officially joined the war in Syria quite recently. But there were threats against Hezbollah made by certain members of the Free Syrian Army Brigade dating back to October of 2012. So before Hezbollah went on the record of saying that they were militarily involved in Syria, okay, they were given particular threats with members of the Free Syrian Army Brigades making statements such as, we're going to bring the war to Beirut and we're going to show you in Beirut. Because Hassan Nasrallah went on the record of saying that he supports political negotiations and he does not support the use of violence. Even though he also, as a political leader, went on the record very much as saying we need to support every single Syrian refugee in Lebanon, regardless of their political affiliations, regardless if they were combatants or civilians. And they have proven to do so, sometimes to really alarming levels. I mean, in their battle in Qusayr, which was, here. This was a battle which Hezbollah participated in, and arguably, I mean, you have two readings. One is that without Hezbollah, the Syrian army wouldn't have won, and the other is, come on, the Syrian army is quite strong. But Hezbollah definitely played a part in making sure that the Syrian army was victorious in Qusayr. Okay, one of the things that Hezbollah then did, which to me strikes me as irrational, but it speaks volumes about Hezbollah, is when they went into there, the wounded Syrians, Hezbollah actually brought them back into Lebanon and afforded them health care and returned them to Syria. And you go, you just shot them on the battlefield, they were injured, not killed, and then you treat them? But you know, they did this. So here you have that level of a leadership that argues that this is the moral way that we operate in war. And you have the other leadership that argues that we're going to kill you in your home front. And we did have a car bombing yesterday morning in Beirut, that two bombs were placed. Fortunately, they did not go off at different times, which was the plan. The plan that was one bomb would go off and then a few minutes later another bomb would go off to cause maximum fatalities. Somehow there were no fatalities. There were 53 wounded. But one of the brigades of the Free Syrian Army has already claimed responsibility. Now, whether or not they did it or not, we don't know, but there's clear intent, a clear intent to cause civilian fatalities within Beirut, within the areas that are believed to be strong supporters of Hezbollah. And so, yes, the war is growing, but it's a long answer again to saying, no, I don't think the Iranian government is going to switch. I'm so sorry for my long answers. It's just that there's so much out there.
I'd like to see more publicity of the leaders like Walter Jones, who are seeing our military as being too large and the destruction of people in the military is something we need to change. And the other people who have some kind of recognition that, you know, like the peace action
Well, I mean, I think it's really powerful that basically, how do we get the positions of these particular leaders, be they Republicans or Democrats, that are calling for the constitutionality of making sure that Congress declares war and not the president, to make sure that the Congress decides about the sending of military aid and not the president, because that is the War Resolutions Act, that is the constitutionality of the action itself. And I think what's powerful is that he is North Carolinian, and I was surprised actually that we do have these elements, and he is a Republican. And I think he would be quite empowered to recognize that Democrats and progressives within the state are supporting him on this appeal. So we're not just looking at him and saying, you're a Republican, I'm going to walk away. Okay? But the fact that a Republican from North Carolina has taken this leadership, and he spoke out quite strongly at the press conference. And this was his language, unconstitutional military action. It speaks volumes that he spoke about the Constitution, particularly at this time where our Constitution is being violated by the president. Okay? And so how to empower this individual, how to get his voice to come out, how to get the North Carolina legislature to hear him and to follow his lead, given that the North Carolina legislature is being led by Republicans, but is arguably violating certain elements of the Constitution, at least a process and procedure. So I think there's a lot in North Carolina that we can do, okay? And to break this fold of bipartisanship, Democrat, Republican, and to actually present it in a different light, constitutional supporters and anti-constitutional supporters. You know, how do maybe we can change the paradigm into that language. But there's a lot of power that comes out from these two bills, and I really think they need to be heard from across the nation, and particularly again in North Carolina. So North Carolina representatives are on the record for the House resolution. There's no current North Carolina senator that's on the record for the Senate bill. So maybe we could put pressure on our two senators on that front. And also contact the local press and let them know that we have leadership coming from North Carolina, and this leadership is behaving in an un-Republican fashion, because typically the idea is Republicans are pro-military, and we have a Republican that is regarding the Constitution as being more important. So there's so many ways that we can swing this, and so many different angles that we can throw on this that would be powerful. And I believe also that the National Peace Action National also has an action alert on these two bills, and so they can be contacted in Washington, D.C. to get more information on that. And I also encourage you all, there's Asad Abu Khalil, who's a professor in California, who's a very witty, sarcastic, cynical writer, just the kind that I like, published a critique of Western media on Syria, and I made a few copies that you all can get in the back. And they're just very succinct, clear to the point critiques of the way Western media have been responding to the crisis in Syria. And given that we have a lot more newspapers over the past few years that are coming from the region itself and that are in English, means that in the United States now there's greater access to reporting on the ground, given that it's being translated by the paper itself. And one of those papers is Al-Akhbar, which you can read in English. It gets translated one day late, but you can access the paper that way. So I'm really, really appreciative of all the time and energy and the fact that you all have stayed so long on a night that has not rained in the Triangle. So thank you so much for your time.